Hello, I'd like to talk about a topic in Chapter 37 that I found very important. Chapter 37 introduces the Cold War, um, goes a little bit more in depth, but what I really wanted to talk about was the space race. The space race was a very important aspect of the Cold War because it, it turned space almost into a new frontier for warfare. Um, the Americans were afraid that the Soviets were going to do that to space. They were going to start sending missiles up into space and then launching them at us. Um, and so started back in the late 1950s with the R-7 booster, or R-7 missile, which was an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. This was the very first ICBM ever to be created. Um, the R-7 would then be used for later missions. It's based The Russian rockets have all come from the same design of the R-7 back in the 1950s, which I find pretty interesting. It's not really relevant right now. But the Soviets then sent up Sputnik and Sputnik 2, which are two satellites. These were the very first satellites also to be put up into space. The Americans hadn't sent up anything. We had one mission called Vanguard, which was also called Flopnik, because it went up, I think, a few feet above the launch pad and then promptly fell back down and exploded. We had Werner von Braun, a German who actually he was a Nazi. He worked on the V2 missile, which is the big kind of football-shaped missile that the Germans used. He used a missile called the Redstone, and they modified it to become the Juno rocket. This Redstone was used later in a couple other forms, such as the Jupiter C rocket, which sent up more satellites, and what would be Mercury Redstone, which is our first attempt at space. So this Juno rocket sent up America's first satellite called Explorer. So we were in space. We had something in space now. We had a little satellite there. So the Russians now had two satellites. Then they sent up a couple dogs up into space. So now they had satellites and living things in space. After a few more satellites, we had gotten the Mercury Redstone mission ready to go. We had Mercury Redstone 1, which was called the 4-inch flight. It didn't crash. There was just a strange computer glitch that when the engines fired and they confirmed liftoff from the pad, the rocket maybe went up 4 inches, then the engines cut, it settled back on the launch pad. The computer, sensing that the engines had cut off, the launch escape tower jettisoned, that just pulls off the capsule in case there's a problem. And the rocket, sensing that the cycle was over, deployed the parachute. So the rocket was standing on the launch pad with its launch escape tower somewhere up in the sky, thinking that it's up in space, getting ready to fall back to Earth, and the parachute deployed, and a bunch of NASA engineers scratching their heads wondering what happened. So after that bug was fixed, we sent up Mercury Redstone 1A, which was a successful test flight of the Mercury Redstone rocket. So Mercury was actually the spacecraft, Redstone was the booster. So then MR2, Mercury Redstone 2, was the spacecraft was loaded up with a monkey named Ham. He was the space champ for America. So his mission went up, and it was just a suborbital ballistic trajectory. So he took off from Florida, went suborbital, got a little bit into space, but then quickly re-entered the atmosphere and splashed down just a couple hundred miles away in the Atlantic Ocean. So there were still a few problems. Ham experienced too many G's on acceleration up into space, so Alan Shepard, who was selected to be the first American in space, did not get to go up as he planned. They wanted to have another test mission to make sure that the acceleration didn't exceed the limits. So this proved to be costly because the Soviets had sent up Vostok 1 carrying Yuri Gagarin, who is the first man in space. The first man. No one else had done it before him. He was the first. He went up and had a few orbits of Earth, and then I think it was one to three, and he came back down to Earth. So the Soviets were celebrating. They had gotten someone up into space. They'd beaten us into space. America was like, no, we got to get someone into space now because the Russians could start sending up warheads and start using space as a new frontier for war. So in May of 1961, just a month after Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight, Alan Shepard was the first American to get up into space. He, again, was on a suborbital ballistic trajectory, just landing a couple hundred miles downrange from Kennedy Space Center. It was not Kennedy Space Center, it was just Cape Kennedy, or Cape Canaveral back then. Now, the space race had become the race to the moon. John F. Kennedy had declared, we choose to go to the moon. He wanted to go to the moon. He wanted to be there first. He told Congress that he was going to do it. He got the funds for it. And so we were now focused on getting to the moon before the Russians. The Russians sent up a couple more missions, but they had a lot of problems with their missions as well. They didn't talk about it much because they were the Soviet Union. They wanted to cover it up. So they had a lot of failures. Vladimir Komarov, Yuri Gagarin's best friend, was actually killed because of a major fault in the brand new Soyuz spacecraft. Nobody knew about it. They all thought that Komarov was killed in a bus crash because that's what the propaganda newspaper said after the landing. So no one actually figured that out until like the 80s or 90s. The Americans now had finished the Mercury program, Mercury Redstone, Mercury Atlas. John Glenn went up in a Mercury Atlas rocket. It was just the same Mercury spacecraft with an Atlas booster. Atlas was another missile. It was a lot stronger, so he could go up into orbit. It had 2 stages to get him into that orbital trajectory and keep him in orbit for a while. So now we move on to a Gemini program, which is basically practicing for Apollo. We started to do spacewalks, but again, we're beaten by the Russians, who sent up a Soyuz. They also had more problems with their spacesuit, because it started inflating when their cosmonaut was up in space. But Ed White, who was killed in the Apollo 1 fire, was the first American to do a spacewalk. He stayed out much longer than Mission Control 1 and 2, just because it was really cool. I was having a great time up there. But Gemini had concluded. We had learned how to dock with a Atlas Agena target vehicle. Done a lot of dress rehearsals for landing on the moon. The Soviets had been working on Soyuz. They'd been working on this brand new moon rocket called the N1. We had now started Apollo. We had started with Saturn 1 and Saturn 1B, which are these rockets that were testing the new Apollo spacecraft, which the spacecraft is referred to is the capsule. The capsule is at the top. The rest of the rocket is just referred to as the booster. So those were testing the Apollo spacecraft and command and service modules. So we were now getting closer to the moon. We had a stronger rocket. We had a new rocket that was a new moon rocket that was being built called the Saturn V. Everyone knows about it. It's a giant 300-foot tall liquid propellant tank, basically. So the Soviets had started testing their N1 moon rocket, but it actually never got to staging. So it never burnt out its first stage and separated into the second. It always exploded. They never had any kind of successful mission with it. Another thing to point out, this going back to the Soyuz program, the initial Soyuz, the Russians had, I believe it was 3 test flights with the new Soyuz rocket. All of them failed, and then they were about to send Komarov up into space. What happened with that one was the solar panels didn't deploy, and he ended up crashing. So, yeah, not good for the Russians. The N1 didn't work out so well. They canceled the N1. They had tried to do a lot more, but by this time, the United States had made it. We had gotten on the moon. The Russians, after a quick lead, had major problems. They had a lot of delays with the N1, and their moon rocket was scheduled to do its first test flight, I believe, a month before Apollo 11 was to land on the moon, or was supposed to launch to land on the moon. I mean, the Americans had already had men go within 100 miles on Apollo 8, and then on Apollo 10 got within 30 miles using the lunar lander. But that was not the landing, so they had to abort, use the fire on the hole, just separate the ascent stage from the descent stage, and then come dock, and then go back to Earth. So America had won the space race. Space became a friendly territory. No wars, nothing happened. No ICBMs were ever launched that were actually intended to kill, that ever had any kind of warhead that actually successfully hit any targets. Space became a area of peace. Actually, in 1970s, we still had a Saturn 1B left from the Apollo program, and what actually happened was we had a truce in space. The Americans launched an Apollo, and the Russians launched a Soyuz, and they docked in space, met up, shook hands. It was called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Program. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum has a replica of the Soyuz and the Apollo spacecraft docked with the adapter. So that was pretty cool, how kind of met up and had a little bit of just kind of like a truce. Now, the Russians are bringing up Americans to the International Space Station. The Americans are bringing up Russians, I believe, with the space shuttle. Space has become a cooperative thing with the Russians, and a lot of people have joined the adventures in space with their own space stations and all that stuff. So really, it never became another front in the war. It never turned the Cold War into an actual war. So, it's just interesting thing in Chapter 37. It really piqued my interest, something I'm really interested in, and just thought I'd share it. Thanks, see ya.